It was supposed to be a miracle drug, a harmless sedative that promised relief from morning sickness. Doctors prescribed it freely, mothers trusted it, pharmaceutical companies profited from it, but hidden behind the promises was a nightmare waiting to unfold. The thalidomide crisis remains one of the greatest medical disasters in history, exposing a catastrophic failure of corporate responsibility and government oversight. Thousands of children were born with devastating birth defects because of a drug that was never adequately tested. But from the tragedy came reform. This crisis reshaped pharmaceutical regulations, strengthened consumer rights, and forced governments to recognize their responsibility in protecting public health. This is a story of rights and responsibilities, a story of unchecked corporate power, regulatory failure, and the fight to ensure that history never repeats itself. The 1950s and early 1960s marked an era of rapid pharmaceutical expansion. The world was changing, and so was medicine. New drugs flooded the market, promising relief, convenience, and progress, often with little government interference. Drug companies had the right to sell and develop their products freely, but did they have the responsibility to ensure that they were safe? Among the many new miracle drugs was thalidomide, developed in West Germany by the company Chemie Grünenthal. Originally intended as a sedative, the drug quickly gained popularity for another reason. It was found to reduce nausea in pregnant women. Marketed as completely harmless, thalidomide spread rapidly across Europe, Australia, Canada, and beyond. It was available over the counter in many countries, no prescriptions, no warnings, no regulations. But behind the success story, a crucial step had been skipped: proper clinical testing for safety in pregnant women. With no standardized requirements for testing on fetal development, thalidomide was distributed to millions without a second thought. The world would soon realize the devastating consequences of this oversight. Then, the unthinkable happened. Across hospitals in Europe, Australia, and Canada, babies were being born with shocking deformities: underdeveloped limbs, missing fingers, blindness, and internal organ damage. In some cases, infants were being born without arms at all, their hands protruding from their shoulders. Others suffered severe heart and brain malformities. Doctors were baffled. What could be causing these unprecedented birth defects? At first, theories ranged from genetic mutations to viral infections, but as the cases multiplied, a disturbing pattern emerged. Dr. William McBride, an Australian obstetrician, noticed a striking connection. Nearly every mother who had given birth to a child with these severe abnormalities had taken one specific drug, thalidomide, during their pregnancy. The pieces of the puzzle were finally coming together. By the time thalidomide was finally pulled from the shelves in 1961, over 10,000 babies had been affected worldwide. Thousands more suffered miscarriages or stillbirths, lives lost before they had even begun, but the damage had already been done. The public was outraged. Across the world, newspapers blared headlines demanding accountability. How had a drug so devastating slipped through the cracks of regulation? How had a medication meant to relieve suffering become a silent executioner? The crisis had exposed deep flaws in the global drug approval process, flaws that had cost thousands of lives. In the United States, one woman's determination had prevented a catastrophe. Dr. Frances Kelsey, a physician and pharmacologist working at the FDA, was assigned to review thalidomide for approval, but something didn't sit right with her. The drug company insisted thalidomide was safe, but their clinical data was incomplete, rushed, and unconvincing. Despite immense pressure from the pharmaceutical industry, Dr. Kelsey refused to approve thalidomide without further testing. Her persistence saved thousands of American babies from suffering the same fate as those in Europe. In 1962, she was honored with the President's Award for Distinguished Federal Civilian Service, one of the highest honors for a government official. In the wake of the tragedy, the U.S. passed the Kefauver-Harris Drug Amendments, a landmark law that revolutionized drug regulation. For the first time, pharmaceutical companies were required to prove both safety and effectiveness before selling a drug. Informed consent became mandatory for clinical trial participants, ensuring that patients had a say in their own treatment. The thalidomide crisis did not fade into history. It became a defining moment in the fight for rights and responsibilities within the pharmaceutical industry. In response, governments around the world introduced stricter drug testing protocols, requiring rigorous clinical trials before any new drug could reach the public. Transparency in pharmaceutical research became a necessity, not an afterthought. Patients were no longer just consumers of medicine. They had rights, and those rights had to be protected. Yet for the victims, justice was slow. Many survivors fought for decades, struggling to receive compensation from the very companies that had assured them that their mother's medication was safe. Legal battles stretched on, with pharmaceutical companies denying responsibilities, blaming outdated regulations, or offering settlements that barely covered the costs of medical bills. Some survivors never received a single cent. Even today, the echoes of thalidomide can still be heard in the ongoing debates over pharmaceutical ethics, drug safety policies, and corporate accountability. The crisis serves as a stark reminder, a warning of what happens when scientific progress moves faster than ethical oversight. The world has changed, but the question remains the same. How do we balance innovation with safety? Who ensures that history does not repeat itself? The thalidomide tragedy was a lesson paid for in human lives, a lesson that must never be forgotten. But remembering is not enough. Action must follow. In the years since the thalidomide crisis, governments have established agencies like the U.S. Food and Drug Administration and the European Medicines Agency, tasked with ensuring that no drug is approved without comprehensive testing. Strict regulations have been put in place, mandating multi-phase clinical trials and post-market surveillance. These policies exist because history demanded them, but the responsibility to uphold them continues today. History is shaped not only by its unfolding events, but also by the perspectives of those who interpret, experience, and respond to them, each adding a layer of complexity to how we understand the past. Yet perspectives on the thalidomide crisis vary. To the victims and their families, it was an unimaginable betrayal, a failure of those entrusted with their safety. But pharmaceutical companies argue that drug development is an inherently complex and uncertain process. At the time, they operated under far fewer regulations, and many claimed that they had no way of foreseeing the devastating effects of thalidomide. Some insist that the drug's tragic consequences spurred necessary reforms, leading to the modern safeguards that exist today. Regulators, too, face scrutiny. Some agencies claim that they lack the authority or scientific knowledge to detect the dangers in time. Others insisted that they acted as swiftly as they could within the limitations of the era's policies. In countries like the United States, where regulatory intervention prevented thalidomide's widespread approval, officials point to their decision as proof that oversight could work, if given the right tools and authority. The thalidomide crisis was not just a failure of science, it was a failure of responsibility. Thousands of lives were irreversibly changed because pharmaceutical companies neglected their duty, regulators failed to act, and the public was denied their right to safety and transparency. This crisis exposed the devastating consequences of ignoring ethical responsibilities in favor of profit and convenience. But history teaches us that rights and responsibilities are inseparable. The right to safe medication comes with the responsibility of rigorous testing. The right to public health protection requires the responsibility of strong government oversight. When those in power neglect these duties, innocent people suffer. But when individuals stand up and demand accountability, change is possible. The thalidomide crisis was a tragedy, but it was also a turning point. Because of this disaster, drug safety laws became stronger, consumer rights gained new protections, and medical ethics became a global priority. This crisis reminds us that the fight for safety, justice, and responsibility never truly ends. The legacy of thalidomide ensures that we never forget what happens when rights are ignored and responsibilities are abandoned.